an anonymous question submitter says, please, forgive me, says, I'm a 28-year-old male, category 2 road cyclist, maintaining a moderately stressful lifestyle almost successful lifestyle. Stressful lifestyle on top of training 10 to 15 hours per week. I understand generally that cortisol and testosterone leads to DHT. What does he mean by DHT, Chad?
It's dihydrotestosterone. We'll
Got
cover that in great depth.
All right. He says, which leads to male pattern baldness. I would love to reverse the trend of my thinning hair, but I think I love winning bike races more. Honestly, I wish I was bald. I'll trade with you. It'd be great to just never have to worry about hair. He says, will commercially available hair loss treatments like finasteride, I believe is how you pronounce that, which act on the testosterone DHT pathway, have an impact, positive or negative, on my cycling training and performance? So coaches, please help me stand on the top step with a luscious head of hair. So we're honestly the podcast to come to for this. Nate has great hair, Chad is on the opposite end of the spectrum, but he has insight to add nonetheless. Chad, and of course, Amber has fantastic hair too. So
we talked about it before the podcast.
We did. She's got a lot of volume today. It's wonderful.
Voluminous.
Yes. So Chad, this asks questions about cortisol, testosterone, DHT, and then if those medications affect that and thusly affect your recovery or performance adaptations, all that stuff. So where do you want to start with this?
Well, first off, I want to go back to our anonymous caller. One line in particular stood out to me. It said, I understand generally that cortisol to testosterone yields DHT, which leads to male pattern baldness. And that's based on the understanding I've accumulated throughout the research. It's not exactly right. So I want to break that down because there is actually a fair amount to unpack here. I mean, we got to talk about cortisol, got to talk about testosterone, and then we got to talk about the ratio between the two before we can even really delve into how it affects baldness and how baldness may affect the treatment of baldness may affect training, et cetera. So it's quite a lot. So, and it's early in the podcast. Nate probably doesn't have to whiz yet, but if you need to go, Nate, that'd be the time.
Already have.
Okay.
Oh, gross. So, Nate's in diapers or something comfy over there. He hasn't left his chair.
That's an image I'll not get out of my mind anytime soon. Thanks.
Sorry, Chad.
Okay.
So that happened.
Okay.
It's a bad visual.
Realign here. Okay, so let's start with cortisol. In particular, what it is and what it isn't. So first off, cortisol is a steroid hormone, a glucocorticoid, a catabolic hormone. So, something that's responsible for the breakdown of a substrate or something, big molecules into smaller molecules. But what it isn't is usually harmful in its natural role. It isn't usually harmful, but for whatever reason, that's the idea everyone has gotten, and there are particular reasons for that. But in terms of it not being harmful in its natural role, a good example is that glucocorticoids themselves are known to be potent antioxidants and potent immunosuppressive agents. And you hear immunosuppression, you think, why would I want to suppress the immune system? Well, in the case of allergic reactions, you very much do. So cortisone shots are often used for that very thing. One study back from 2008 by Hackney and colleagues even noted that by attempting to suppress the production of cortisol at rest or during exercise may actually compromise adaptive capabilities. So we're actually working against ourselves by trying to limit something that we don't really understand if that's our aim. Cortisol is involved in adaptation to exercise stress, to my point here. And an example would be the catabolic actions in muscle cells do actually break down muscle proteins. That's real. But these can be used via various mechanisms, one of them being gluconeogenesis, which is the creation of glucose in the liver from non-carbohydrate substrate. So non-carbs making blood sugar for energy. Secondly, it's used to augment what's termed the free amino acid pool. So the idea being that this pool exists and that the damaged proteins that occur from exercise and any other thing that breaks down muscle tissue are broken down into recyclable components that are later used for synthesis of new proteins. So this is protein.
This goes good, Chad. That's a good accent. Yeah.
So this is the very nature of protein balance, right? The whole degradation versus synthesis. If we're leaning toward the degradation side, we're in negative protein balance. Leaning toward the synthesis side, positive. So just because we're breaking down muscle protein doesn't mean we're losing muscle. It's going into a pool that could very well be used to regenerate. So all our protein that does synthesize muscle tissue doesn't necessarily come from our diet. Some of it comes from our body, and it's not a bad thing. Not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, cortisol is crucially important in exercise. It works on so many levels. It has so many functions, a number of them that I'm about to go into. Intensification of that gluconeogenesis that I just talked about. So creation of glucose in the liver from other things than carbohydrate. Activation of your hepatic glycogen stores. So, breaking down the glycogen that's stored in your liver so that we can fuel the muscles. Mobilization of amino acids, kind of just touched on that. Stimulation of lipolysis, which is the breakdown of stored triglycerides into free fatty acids and glycerol backbones that go into the process of gluconeogenesis and yield glucose. And it's linked to hunger cues. So to put all this really simply, it helps provide materials that are necessary for the production of energy, and it also helps us with the motivation for intake. It prompts us to eat, especially important during an endurance event.
Yeah, and actually, Chad, and this is also, that's particularly important, like you said, during an endurance event, and also just through training cycles. Endurance athletes, we have this complicated relationship with food, and we can kind of push ourselves to ignore a lot of these signals, and even some repatterning can happen with eating disorders. So once again, these important things like you're talking about here, they're there for a reason, right? And they help us.
Yep. Yeah, your body's cues, you can ignore them, but at your own peril in a lot of cases. Okay, so also, and it sounds counter to everything I just mentioned, but cortisol is responsible for the sparing of glucose and glycogen, and this is part of its anti-anabolic nature. So it's catabolic, right, in that it breaks down, but anti-anabolic is the other side of things where it prevents things from building. In this case, it'd be glycogen, right? We don't want to take that blood glucose and chain it together and create glycogen somewhere. We actually want to use it. So it plays a role in preventing that from happening at inopportune times. So to put all this another way, it mobilizes us to fight stress by doing three things, amongst others: ensuring stable delivery of glucose to the working muscles, stimulating tissue regeneration, so that muscle protein synthesis we just talked about, and inhibiting inflammatory processes. So another thing it is intensity dependent. So cortisol release is actually relative to the level of effort. And that's interesting in and of itself. And most papers pin that at between 50 and 60% of VO2 max. A number of them put it at greater than 60% of VO2 max. Anything above that, you're going to see an uptick in circulating cortisol. But the point is, moderate to high intensity work, you're going to see an increase in circulating cortisol. But what's important to note is that this threshold can increase with training. So the more exercise trained you are, the more blunted your cortisol response is. So maybe before it happened at 60%, and then you trained a bunch and it happens at 62, 65, 68, whatever. So the important thing, or I'm sorry, moving on, that's with low and moderate intensity. When it comes to low intensity work, moderate and high intensity work. When it comes to low intensity work, we'll get a cortisol uptick there too, but that's duration dependent. And this may be the best case for a little bit of amino acid supplementation in carbohydrate drink, right? So if you're on a long ride or a long run where you're going to be running low on fuel, well, this is a strong argument for including some amino acids into that nourishing mixture. What's interesting is that circulating cortisol declines in short duration, low intensity exercise though. So this is kind of counter to what we think. And it's kind of similar to the way blood lactate works. So if you look at a lactate curve, we see it hovering at a level and then it just goes up as exercise intensity increases, right? But what you don't see is if that same athlete being measured were measured sitting on that exercise bike, but not pedaling, or standing on the treadmill, but not yet running, once they start to work, lactate dips because it's being utilized. And similar to those VO2 uptake kinetics that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, it's that lag between what the body's demanding and what the body's furnishing. There's a little communication gap. It's being utilized. The body realizes it's being utilized and it needs to replace it. And then we get the uptick and then the eventual, sustained increase. Okay. Additionally, cortisol is involved in harmful physiological processes. This is true, but it's when it's at high persistent levels. So persisting high levels is the key term here. And in that case, inhibition of bone formation, issues with calcium absorption, those two go hand in hand. Potentially insulin resistance, dyslipidemia, which is, unfavorable blood lipid levels, hypertension or high blood pressure, obesity, pretty general term, but muscle weakness, slow wound healing, increased risk of infection. All of these things happen, but they assume that there's a malfunction in what's the negative feedback system of the whole cortisol delivery system, which is your HPA axis. So your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your adrenal systems, your adrenal glands, all work together via this negative feedback system. A production of one thing leads to a production of another, leads to a production of another. Once that last thing builds up to a point, it leads to a decrement in the thing that produced it, and so on down the line. So this feedback loop is working at all times. When that malfunctions, you see things that mimic or are something like Cushing's syndrome, where you get an overproduction of cortisone. But athletes simply don't reach levels anywhere near this. And I linked to a study or a review actually that covers this in great detail. It's pretty interesting. Furthermore, even people with excessive psychological stress or anxiety disorders typically exhibit higher cortisol levels than athletes do. So, the advice here is simply to manage your stress, to recognize that there are a lot of things that are within your control outside of training that can influence your levels of persistent cortisol. Two more things. So cortisol is potentially influenced by diet. This is an important side note that things like several days of low carbohydrate intake can increase your cortisol response to exercise. Similarly, so can temperature. Extreme hot, extreme cold can actually increase circulating levels of cortisol. So change that cortisol response to exercise depending on environmental characteristics. Okay, so much shorter because we've covered testosterone in the past. I'm just going to run through, what are some typical actions that we associate with testosterone. Obviously, it influences muscle mass, fat distribution, red blood cell production, bone mass. And these are all the things that are relevant to this discussion and relevant to us as endurance athletes. Many other things, though. But there are different types of testosterone. So there's free testosterone, which isn't bound to any other proteins, and it is the most accessible for activity. So again, the most relevant to us. And then there's bound testosterone. Some of it's bound to albumin, which is the protein in your blood, and some of it's bound to sex hormone binding globulin. And in both cases, rendered inactive. So the big concern is that a reduction in testosterone is going to signal a reduction in all the anabolic goings on. That's what we're concerned with. So, the question then becomes, what are the ways to increase testosterone? And this, again, we've covered in the past, so I'm going to be quick. Increase your physical activity, pretty straightforward. Exercise, weight training. Add that to the long list of reasons why you need to figure out how to balance the demands of weight training with the demands of endurance training in order to become a better endurance athlete. And then high intensity interval training, both things that are very familiar and dear to the hearts of us as TrainerRoad subscribers, users. Okay, so now back to the interrelation between cortisol and testosterone. One study back in 2005 actually demonstrated a negative relation between cortisol and total testosterone. News to nobody, but what was a bit surprising was that there's a positive relation between cortisol and free testosterone. So something that flies entirely counter to what we all think we understand about this ratio. But what that tells us, or what that does, is it begins raising questions around the utility of this testosterone cortisol ratio. So let's talk about the ratio now, and we'll get to the actual question itself. So with regards to this testosterone cortisol ratio, this TC ratio, just how useful is this, what I consider to be a not too accessible metric? And I think most people would agree, because cortisol can be measured via the saliva, super easy, but then you actually have to measure it and interpret it. Testosterone has to be measured via a blood draw. And this imposes certain limitations on anything you want to do real time and the frequency of the draws, because unless I'm mistaken, I don't think this is a blood draw akin to a fingertip or an earlobe prick. I think it's an actual draw. So the idea is that this information is going to be used to determine whether exercise generates a catabolic or an anabolic environment. Are we in a process of, breaking things down when we don't want to be breaking them down? Or have we reached, that anabolic end goal that furthers adaptation and therefore performance? So to get into the weeds for just a second, and not that far, Structurally alike hormones actually compete for receptor binding sites. And if you think back to when we talked about caffeine, how, adenosine over the course of a day binds to these particular receptors and we get sleepier and sleepier and eventually go to bed. We can block those receptors because caffeine is a similarly structured hormone. So it slips in there and it blocks that adenosine from accumulating. And, we get our little bump in wakefulness. So testosterone is on the anabolic side. And also the anti-catabolic side, which is not an opposite. They're two mildly different things. And then cortisol is on the catabolic side or the anti-anabolic side. And it's going to be the preponderance of one over the other, this testosterone to cortisol ratio, that's going to determine whether or not we're in a largely synthetic or degradation, state of degradation. However, numerous challenges to using this so-called stress metric exist. I mean, so many things can influence cortisol. So your acute training, so the training that you just did can change it. The training effects. So everything you've done up to a point. So the last days, weeks, months of training can affect it. Your motivation can affect it. Just how switched on are you regarding what it is you're about to do? Even the competitive venue, knowing where you have to go can ramp you up. So it's really tough to use this ratio's information to affect your training when you have so many potential sources, so many things that could be affecting it. How do you decipher which of those things is causing it such that you can modify your training?
It's a great example. Sorry, Chad, if I can just interject here. This is a great example of just because we can measure it doesn't mean that it can actually drive improvements, right?
Yes, entirely.
Right.
And let alone, like you said, even like actually measuring them and interpreting them is difficult, but just because you can measure it doesn't mean that it can drive performance. That's great.
True.
Great point.
It can just lead us down the wrong roads. I mean, there might be relevant information there, but determining what's relevant, what's not, that's a pretty big challenge. So again, the idea is that when we monitor this relationship, we can point to situations of overreaching and overtraining, and steer the ship a different direction, right? And yes, it's true. There does appear to be a linkage between resting testosterone and cortisol levels in endurance trained triathletes. And I linked to a particularly relevant study. But whether it's causal or associative, whether it's, correlation or cause, that aside, exercise-induced cortisol does appear to have a negative relationship with post-exercise total testosterone. But again, some studies look at free testosterone. Some studies look at total testosterone. So we can't balance those against one another. How do we pull findings from that? There are seasonal variations. So, in our parlance, training adaptations, and these can influence it. So the more adapted we become, the less conversion of cortisol to cortisone, the inactive to the active forms. And I linked to a paper if you want to nerd out on just exactly how those two things play back and forth.
Always.
So with athletes, cortisol levels rise, but then they level off at a higher but still non-detrimental level. So even a sustained uptick in cortisol may not be saying anything needs to change. Mm-hmm. Again, just another form of training adaptation. Add to this, there's a circadian influence on it that we got to account for. Think of the waking response of cortisol. Think about teasing out the effects of your previous exercise load, so everything you've done up to a point, and then upcoming stress. Just the anticipation of what comes next can affect your cortisol. So we're looking at physical, psychological, physiological stressors that all affect circulating levels of cortisol. And then finally, exhaustive endurance exercise, which I'm sure we've all faced at one time or another, where you really run the ship into the beach, has a long recovery time course. It can take cortisol somewhere in the ballpark of 2 full days to return to baseline levels. All the while, the free testosterone can take more like 3 days to return to its level. And I linked to that study. And the point of that study is that this testosterone cortisol ratio is a questionable value in general, but especially during that acute recovery phase. Look at it anytime within that 3-day window, and what is it going to tell you that's useful?
So this is interesting because I get flooded with which this is probably revealing a lot about my internet activity, but I get flooded with ads that are always like, got belly fat, cortisol is the enemy. And that is like, and cortisol is always pitched as this like terrible thing that you want none of. And that it comes about because you don't sleep. And that's the problem, or it comes about because you don't eat the right way, and any cortisol is bad, basically.
Yeah,
and
it's marketable because it plays on people's misunderstanding of what it's actually doing.
And what you're showing here is that it's much more nuanced than that. And it has good purposes and it serves those purposes. And excess, just like of anything, can be bad and can cause bad effects. But also another great takeaway with this, and Chad, I know we haven't even gotten to answering his question, but I just want to kind of summarize this.
It's coming.
Another great takeaway to this is the fact that, so you have this thing, you can measure it, you can try to focus on it, you can do all that stuff. But then all the information you're getting, there's information for average people and there's information for athletes. And we receive marketing messaging all the time for both, but we see it for an average person. And many times we think that it applies to us as well. But an athlete that's training, that's working for something, doing that sort of thing is likely more balanced and is likely not dealing with the over accumulation like you were talking about in this case, likely, I should say. So once again, whatever you see, read, hear, everything else, the information, you have to take it with a grain of salt. If you're an active person that's training and doing that sort of thing, you're likely more regulated. And the same advice may not need to apply for you versus a sedentary person. So, awesome. So Chad, how does these hair loss drugs, because that's like and this is like a dude fear here. It's like, can't drop my T levels, man.
Not just a dude fear. Yeah.
Yeah. So and that's a good point too, but yeah, let's get into it.
Okay. So with, I hope a better understanding of testosterone, cortisol, and the ratio of how those two things relate. Let's look at how hair loss and the treatment of hair loss actually impact testosterone and, therefore probably performance. So before we get started though, age, stress, diet, the ways you can supplement your diet, exercise, hormones, all of these things can affect hair loss. Okay, so I'm not trying to ignore those other factors, but a genetic predisposition to male pattern baldness and in females, female pattern hair loss, scientifically referred to as adrenogenetic alopecia, appears to be the leading driver. And the reason being is this DHT that we talked about, or that we mentioned earlier, that he asked about, that our anonymous subscriber asked about. This is dihydrotestosterone, and it too is an androgen, which, male sex hormone is probably not the best term for it because it doesn't apply simply to males. Females produce these hormones as well. They just don't do it typically they don't do it in the same high quantities. It's a testosterone byproduct, and it's produced by, it sounds like I'm trying to get wordy and fancy here, but 5-alpha reductase. And that's an enzyme that's important because we're going to come back to it. It's especially important in this discussion. And this DHT is apparently 5 times more potent than testosterone, which if you read that, you're thinking, oh, I definitely want more DHT. But the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, into DHT, takes place in the skin, in the liver, in the prostate, and in the hair follicles. Of all I looked at 16 or so, literally 16 papers to varying degrees. And not once did I see anything about the conversion of testosterone to DHT within the muscles. So I do not think this has anything to do with muscular testosterone. So what it does is it binds the receptors in hair follicles and actually causes something termed miniaturization. I also saw the term catagen, which is a phase of growth. I'm not sure if those two things are interchangeable, but they're certainly along the same lines, both of which lead to an eventual end of hair growth in those who are genetically susceptible to hair loss. So you may say I'm off the hook. I'm probably not genetically susceptible, but by the age of 50, the National Institutes of Health have said that on the order of 50 million men and 30 million women in the US will be afflicted with either male pattern baldness or female pattern hair loss. So in a nutshell, your hair follicle sensitivity to DHT is in your genes. So, and what's interesting about this is that though it is responsible for hair loss, it's actually responsible for hair growth elsewhere on your body, less desirable locations, which is unfortunate, but is what it is. Okay, so the literature seems to agree that DHT is the primary hormone responsible for hair loss. And so that makes the prevention rationale to block DHT in order to slow or prevent hair loss. And this can be done via topical application, but the criticism there is that it doesn't fully block DHT binding. So drugs are another way to go. And this finasteride and then alternatively dutasteride, probably pronouncing both those wrong, a link to a particular study on that actually shows that dutasteride in particular is not in any way related to muscle loss or any of the things that you might think if you limit testosterone you'd be facing. So check that out if you're interested. But these drugs claim to actually block DHT, and they do this by blocking the conversion of testosterone to that dihydrotestosterone, DHT, by binding that enzyme that I mentioned earlier, that 5-alpha reductase. So they're referred to as 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. They stop the process, right? And they do so at the source. So DHT production never takes place. And this in turn stops most hair loss and can actually reverse miniaturization should it have occurred. Unfortunately, you got to catch it while it is in process, because apparently once it's gone forever. So the logic is that any increase in testosterone carries a potential increase in DHT. But again, the conversion of testosterone to DHT takes place in the liver, the skin, the prostate, and the hair follicles. Again, I didn't see any apparent impact on muscles and therefore for performance in my reading. And I looked at a pretty wide date range and included quite a lot of papers. So, dear anonymous subscriber, I understand your logic, but my conclusion is that these medications don't look as though they'd impact your testosterone, only a byproduct of your testosterone, this DHT. And DHT seems to be aimed at other physiological processes anyway. And studies on both this finasteride and dutasteride didn't negatively impact fat-free mass or muscle strength, amongst other things that would be a concern for us as athletes. So by inhibiting this particular enzyme, this 5-alpha reductase, it really only impacts DHT, not free testosterone, not total testosterone. And if you'll allow me to speculate, I think if anything, that would mean that more testosterone is available since it's not converted to DHT. But I don't know for sure. So in my opinion, based on my reading, no apparent cause for concern. So with all that in mind, I have just a couple parting thoughts. And the first one relates to that testosterone to cortisol relation, because first off, is it a cause of hair loss, of decreases in performance? Very probably not. The same ratio as a metric for overreaching, overtraining, waters are pretty muddy to say anything with any level of certainty. So I just don't think there's anything there. And then finally, I will personally recommend, and no, I'm not a doctor, but I am a follicularly challenged male. Caffeine. We've all seen Alpacin, right? I mean, giant Alpacin,
Right, yeah.
Alpacin Phoenix.
Yeah.
And every time I see it, I think, come on, caffeine on your scalp, what's that going to do? There's actually a fair amount of research out there. And one review in particular noted that hair follicles kind of have their own HPA axis, or at least a functional equivalent to it. And it can be affected by caffeine. I quote, caffeine, quote, counteracts testosterone-induced growth inhibition and alone promoted hair shaft elongation in AGAHFs, so androgenetic alopecia hair follicles. So it grew hair. Another study in 2007, and though it was in vitro, so they did this outside of the body, identified caffeine as a stimulator of human hair growth and recognized its efficacy of a topical solution. So in my opinion, I'd much rather put something like this on my body than take a medication. But there's nothing to say you couldn't do both. And honestly, I ordered some of this up. I'm curious. I mean, I've got some miniaturization on particular parts of my head that I think make me a very viable candidate for this treatment. So why not? I mean, it costs $8, and TrainerRoad bought it because we talked about it on the podcast. So I'm gonna give it a shot.
Can you imagine Chad with a full, healthy, like Marcel Kittle head of hair?
I'll pull my
just
hat
comes out of
off
the podcast next week, gives us a hair twirl.
Except blonde, yeah.
That would be amazing.
Not likely, but I am curious.
So to recap this, Chad, it sounds like basically DHT is what's affecting this hair growth. And you have testosterone and DHT being a byproduct of that. And the medicine, in this case, the medication that they're looking at, looks at directly addressing DHT and likely doesn't affect testosterone levels. So in this case, it's likely not inhibiting recovery, adaptation, everything else that athletes are concerned about in terms of their role with testosterone.
Yep.
So cool. I never knew that about cortisol. I never had that straight, the response, its role, everything else like that. Thanks, Chad.
Yeah, it's a much maligned reputation, and unfairly so.
Yeah. Man, Alpacin, they always sponsor riders with great hair, teams with riders with great hair,
right?
Too. They have Vanderpool now.
You put Vanderpool on top of, basically any podium, and
yeah,
Olympic podium.
If they have Wout Van Aert, then they would be like
Yeah,
a
right.
box checked. He even has like cool colors in his hair. He looks like Storm from X-Men. So
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.